Hello and welcome back to the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. My name is Aidan and Leah and I'm here with my co-host Leah Heigl, and this is episode 43, where we will be talking about whether or not soy is good or bad for your health. Personally, I've got a bit of general knowledge about this, but it's not something I'm really a deep expert in, because I don't really need to be. I don't see many cases where it really impacts my clients or anything like that. Because a lot of things are probably going to be more relevant if somebody has a really high soy intake. So I don't see a lot of that. Leah sees a little bit more of that, I assume. It's a bit more relevant for the kind of stuff she does. And we figured that this is probably going to be a bit of a good episode in terms of something we can point back to anytime anybody asks us a question being like, is soy good or bad for your health, or how much is okay and anything like that. We can just point to this episode. But because of all of that, we're going to do it in a bit of an interview format where I'm pretty much just asking Leah questions and she's pretty much just answering them. So starting off, we're just going to start off with background stuff, very, very general, and then I'm just going to ask stuff that I'm personally interested in. So the first question is, what foods contain soy and how much do people normally consume?
Yeah, that's probably a good place to start. So if you're not sure where soy usually comes from, we're thinking things like edamame, obviously soybeans, tofu, tempeh, soy milk, textured vegetable protein. So really thinking about those plant-based proteins that are really common in a vegetarian and vegan diet, not so much in the standard Australian diet. So we might have a little bit of some soy protein fortified foods in a normal Australian diet, but it's pretty low. So generally, standard Australian's going to eat 1 to 2 serves per week of soy foods, and usually it's going to be a soy fortified product rather than a block of tofu.
Yeah, cool. All right, so jumping into, I suppose, the most pertinent kind of topic, but I want to start real vague and then I'll go more specific. What are the proposed negatives of soy consumption? What are people talking about? What are people caring about?
I guess I kind of break it up into 4 main topics usually. So one that comes up a lot in the fitness space would be feminizing effects in men. So that tends to be an overarching one. One I see a lot is issues with fertility in women and some worry around that. Third would be just general cancer risk. So soy increasing cancer risk. And 4 would be issues with thyroid function, particularly people that already have low thyroid function. Does soy then go on to affect it further?
Yeah. So starting off with that first one, feminizing effects in men, where does that come from? Why would people think that? What would the mechanism be? And actually, let's just start with the mechanism. What would the mechanism be?
Yeah, so let's start with phytoestrogens,
Yeah,
because that's particularly what people are concerned about when it comes to soy. So there's a little bit of debate generally around GMO and soy, but we're kind of going to leave that out of this discussion because it's a rabbit hole of its own in terms organic and whatnot. But we really want to focus on phytoestrogens because they are, I guess people worry because they have the word estrogen in them. Yeah. So they are a hormone, but they're a plant hormone. So they can have estrogen type effects in the human body, but they're really, really minimal. But the effects are still there. So people are still concerned that, maybe they'll increase estrogen levels in the body, have issues with fertility, feminizing effects in men, and that's kind of where the fear comes from. Generally, I find there's that one article that was in Men's Health magazine. It would have been 2010, something like that, 2008. That was a bit of a fear-mongering around soy, where there was this case study of this one 60-year-old man who was drinking 3 liters of soy milk per day, so a lot of soy milk. And then he did end up, his estrogen levels did increase. He experienced breast tissue growth, erectile dysfunction, and low libido as well. Yeah. So they're the 4 main things he complained of. And when looking at his diet, they realized that man, this guy's having a lot of soy. And when they took the soy out of his diet, all those issues did go away. Yeah. He returned to baseline in terms of his estrogen levels. All the side effects went away. Issue with that case study is it is a standalone one-person situation. It's not obviously a population study. So that's not the peak of evidence. And the second part of that is 3 liters of soy milk. So that's way more than the definitely the standard Australian diet, but even when we're thinking vegetarians and vegans, we tend to consume about 40 to 60 milligrams of these soy isoflavones in general.
Yeah.
Even a little bit lower for some vegetarians that are not super soy focused. This guy would have been having 360 milligrams per day of these soy isoflavones. I guess I should mention that phytoestrogens and isoflavones are interchangeable concepts to a certain extent, so I'm just going to use that interchangeably.
Yeah, cool. So just out of my own curiosity, is like, because that's just one case study, but it obviously begs the question of, is this a bit of a spectrum? Is this something where it's like, okay, zero soy intake means you have none of these effects, like a moderate soy intake means you probably don't even notice these effects, and then a super high one might lead to this? But do we have anything else like on really high soy intakes and that concept? Is there anything on that?
To be honest, there's not a lot of research that is someone consuming that amount of soy.
Yeah.
So generally when we're looking at research, the most that people that will usually get is about 100 milligrams of these soy isoflavones. So like he was consuming almost 4 times the amount that we even see in research at its highest amounts. So it's really hard to say, like, I'm sure he's probably not the only person that's ever going to experience that from that level of soy intake. It's just that that's so out of the norm and we don't have research on it. Generally, research in men looking at effects on estrogen levels and soy intake, when it's like moderate to even mildly high, tends to have nil effect.
Yeah, okay, gotcha. Yeah, super interesting. Cool. And that's obviously pretty relevant because like a lot of people are like scared of having small amounts. Like,
people are like scared of having tofu like once.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm not going to eat that. So you're not going to experience these feminizing effects from having a few serves of soy per week.
Yeah.
If anything, it probably is even good for our health.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on the good for health kind of aspect a little bit later. I want to go through the bad, quote unquote, the bad stuff first.
Yeah.
Next one, fertility in women. So that was something you talked about. Like, that's a bit of a complex area, isn't it? It's like pretty mixed.
It's really, really complex. So if we look at the research as a whole, mild to moderate soy intake looks like it improves pregnancy and fertility outcomes.
Yeah.
As a whole, looking at all of the research. But I don't like to brush things off and go, oh, there's no effect, because we know that phytoestrogens can act on pretty much any like sex organ that we have, because it does mimic estrogen in some way. So to say it has like no effect, I think would be missing the mark a little bit. There's basically 3 case studies. So very similar to the 6-year-old man that had 3 liters of soy milk per day. There was 3 case studies in the research of women consuming, they estimated it to be over 100 milligrams of soy isoflavones per day on average. And these 3 women experienced loss of period, difficulty with fertility, and a few other issues.
Yeah.
And again, once they removed soy from the diet, all those issues went away. So there was like clearly some link between the 2.
Yeah.
But generally, the research at a population level says that it's not really going to be an issue.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a mixed bag. Most of it's positive, but that like tiny little bit of negative research I think is worth knowing about.
Yeah, like just worth being aware of, I guess.
Yeah, because potentially maybe there are people that are more sensitive than others.
Yeah.
Maybe there is going to be that one woman in a fertility clinic wondering why she's not getting pregnant.
Yeah.
And maybe she's vegan and eating a lot of soy foods. So it's worth considering. It's probably not the reason most people are infertile, like obviously, but it's worth noting, I reckon.
For sure. That third one you mentioned was cancer risk. How does soy play a role there?
So in regards to cancer risk, a lot of people assume that soy foods are going to increase the risk of some cancers. But based on the research, we actually know that it's probably beneficial for reducing the risk of some cancers. So breast cancer is one, prostate cancer in men is another where it seems quite positive. So breast cancer is one. So the largest and most detailed study to investigate soy intake and the risk of like breast cancer developing was the Shanghai Women's Health Study. So that had over 70,000 participants and it was long term. So like a huge study. And they found that women who ate the most soy had 59% lower risk of breast cancer compared to those who ate the lowest amount of soy.
How much is that? 59%.
59%.
That's pretty huge, yeah.
So, like, that's huge. So, this was in China, so potentially their higher intake of soy. It's probably a little bit higher intake of soy than what we'd have here in Australia generally as well. But that's a huge statistic. So, not only does soy not cause breast cancer, it's maybe protective against breast cancer.
Yeah, that's interesting, hey? Because I have heard people like link the two, but it's interesting to see like in breast cancer in that large scale study, not only was it not increasing the risk, it was...
It's decreased, and by a fair amount.
Yeah.
So, like, overall, when it comes to cancer and soy intake, seems pretty positive and beneficial rather than the other way around.
Yeah, super interesting. And then the last one that we were going to touch on, thyroid function. We've spoken off air about this, but it is a complex topic. But do you want to give a bit of a broad overview on that? And I might ask some more specific stuff if anything comes up.
Yeah, let's start with people taking thyroid medication, because I feel like that's the easiest place to start. So we know that soy does interact with thyroid medication to a certain extent. So if you are on thyroid medication and you eat a lot of soy, it's probably worth speaking to your doctor about if you're going to like have a sudden increase in soy intake. And it's also best to not have soy like 3 to 4 hours around the time you take medication. So there has been some worry around a high soy intake potentially reducing thyroid function in people with already compromised thyroid function. And once again, looking at the breadth of the research, it doesn't seem that it does that. So a moderate soy intake does seem to be okay for people that do have hypothyroidism. But there are some studies where people did have moderate soy intakes and their thyroid hormones did change in a negative way. But the researchers didn't deem it clinically significant enough to kind of say, oh, X equals X, you know? But I think, it's worth noting that there is some change in thyroid hormones at a certain point in some people with soy intake.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote a blog post on Hashimoto's, so underactive thyroid in that case, and it was something that I kind of saw as well, where it's kind of like a lot of people in the thyroid space who are not necessarily quote unquote like evidence-based practitioners will very much be like, no soy ever. That's going to make things worse. And then there's a lot of people in the evidence-based space who are just like, no, soy is completely fine. But
I think it's more nuanced than that, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like, I think for most people, particularly if you're on thyroid medication, it's probably not going to make a huge difference to have a mild to moderate soy intake.
Yeah.
But even like thinking about some of the vegans I work with in the sports space, some of them do have underactive thyroid and are trying to eat a lot of protein and therefore having a lot of soy in their diet. So I do wonder for those people, is it an issue at that point? And with the research, there's not a lot of research that has a really high soy intake the way that vegans are starting to consume it, or the way at least I consume it and other people in the sports space that are vegan consume it. So I think it's just worth putting a bit of a question mark on and going, it's not as clear cut as maybe we think. Yeah.
And to the best of my knowledge, like I read every study on that topic that I could find, which is a bit of a sign that there's not that much research. Like, I mean, I do try hard, but I'm like, if there was like hundreds of studies, I wouldn't have read every study.
This is true.
Which is like what makes me kind of like, it's hard because it's like, there's different levels to this, like really high soy intakes, moderate, low soy intakes, all these kind of things. Medications, what if you're just on the border of like having underactive thyroid, but your thyroid stimulating hormone is high, or like all these, there's so many different presentations of this.
Yeah.
And how does soy affect all of those? Yeah. Nuanced, as you said.
Very nuanced. I think there was one study that I came across that kind of changed my mind on things, because previously I thought I was kind of in the camp of like, oh, you don't need to worry about it.
Yeah.
It's not an issue. I probably a bit biased because I love soy.
Yeah.
But looking into it a bit more, I found one study where they had a group of people that had hypothyroidism, and they put one on a diet that had the amount of phytoestrogens that was normal for like the Australian diet, so 1 to 2 milligrams per day, and the other group was like simulating like a vegetarian diet where they were having about 16 to 20 milligrams of these phytoestrogens per day. And then they measured their thyroid function over 6 months, I believe. And there was a 3-fold increase in progression from subclinical to overt hypothyroidism in that vegetarian group.
Yeah.
I mean, the difference was 2 people became clinically, like, had an underactive thyroid in one group and 6 in the other group. So it could just be the matter of, like, unlucky splitting of participants.
Random
like
chance,
just
potentially.
Random chance. But it's also like, it also could mean
worth
something.
being aware of, yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. So I suppose that's going through like a lot of the common potential downsides that people are thinking of or talking about or everything like that. So we're going to look at it from the other perspective, not just from the health perspective, but also just like what are the benefits? Like what are other reasons to be consuming soy? So going through that, like, I don't know, rattling off a few things, like what could be some of the benefits?
I mean, if you're plant-based at all, it's such a good source of protein that's super high quality. It's so versatile. So in that way, I love soy. I die for soy. Love it. I eat so much of it. So yeah, it's great in that way. There's also quite a bit of research of in menopausal, like postmenopausal women consuming soy and it helping with menopausal symptoms like hot flushes and even bone health post-menopause due to like that estrogen effect that phytoestrogens have.
Yeah.
So it might be protective against bone loss in post-menopause. So
That's
I think that's
interesting.
pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And then you have the cancer stuff, so the like breast cancer in particular and also prostate cancer that it might be protective against.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of benefits to soy intake. It's just like, can you take it too far is the question.
Yeah, for real. Yeah, okay. So one of the obvious questions we've got from that quality protein perspective, I assume like it's a complete amino acid profile, like it's higher quality protein.
Pretty much.
Are there many other vegan sources that fit that criteria?
It is pretty much the only one that is really high quality and efficient and has a good leucine content.
Yeah.
So leucine is the amino acid that is known for triggering muscle protein synthesis. So we know if you're focused on muscle building, muscle recovery, that leucine content's quite important. It's pretty much the only good source of leucine on a plant-based diet.
Yeah.
So that's something to consider from a sports perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, for real. I feel like this is almost too simple. The positives where it's just like complete source of protein. It gives you another option and also taste variety and stuff like that. Like I think about it, I'm like, if I'm on a plant-based diet, there's obviously less variety than there is by definition compared to being omnivorous. Like you've literally cut out a lot of foods, just like you have with any dietary approach, but like there's less good protein sources. So even if one just happened to be equal with all the other ones, you'd still want it as an option.
100%.
Let alone the fact that it is one of the only complete protein sources. So although we've kept it like a lot shorter than, like from the positive perspective, we have kept it shorter than we have on the other perspective, but like what would you say are like the key takeaways from all of this? Like a bit of a summary from what we've talked about.
Yeah. So I think the key takeaways would be generally soy is a great food and the fear mongering that happens around it, not really, it's not ideal because it is a really great source of protein, particularly for plant-based people. But generally, I'd say for women who do want to get pregnant, generally limiting it to 4 to 5 serves of soy per day at like the most, probably something to kind of chuck in there in terms of fertility recommendations just in case. I want to kind of reiterate that feminizing effects in men is just not something we've ever seen in the research outside of that one single crazy case study. And that, generally phytoestrogens can be protective against cancers and that postmenopausal stuff. So I think those would definitely be the key takeaways.
Yeah, I see it as we're like kind of like reaching to find downsides. Like we've really like gotten out of our way to find any downsides, yet like the way it's kind of messaged is if like the average person needs to be concerned about it, which is not the case.
Yeah, I don't, like I said, I don't want to be that person that brushes off everyone's, I guess, worries about soy. Like I want to address them.
Yeah.
It's just that you've probably noticed that most of the negative stuff is a handful of case studies, which we know is not going to be the peak of evidence-based research. So we are really reaching to find negative things about soy.
Yeah. Easy. Well, we'll wrap things up there. So this has been episode 43 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. Thank you to everybody who's been listening. And as always, if you could please leave a rating and review, that would be massively appreciated.